As someone who knows just a little bit more than the average person about the power scaling community, I do get pretty tired of seeing people on the outside of that community criticizing it without really knowing anything about it. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely understand why they think what they think. The power scaling community does not do a good job of ingratiating new people, and its loudest members are also by far the worst it has to offer. But there is a lot more to it than the average person thinks. Enter Noah Greenspan and his video, Top 5 Worst Things About Power Scaling. Now, before I begin explaining the misconceptions present in this video, I want to say a couple things. Mainly, and most importantly, no hate to this guy. I really don't even know who he is, and the video is overall pretty good. I enjoyed watching it. It's not like all of his points are completely terrible. He has things to say that are worth saying, and the video is pretty funny. The problem, and this is a theme I'm going to revisit a few times, is that he seems to get his opinion on power scaling entirely from Versus Battle Wiki and a few annoying people he's met online. And that gives him a very skewed perception of the community, and that ends up making his commentary a lot less accurate. If this video was just about why Versus Battle Wiki is terrible, I'd have nothing to say about it, genuinely. Like, some of the information in it still wouldn't be 100% accurate, but like, whatever. People make mistakes. I make mistakes in my videos. It's totally fine. And that video would have a reason to exist. He makes a point in this video about how big of an impact Versus Battle Wiki has. And yeah, they do. Telling people not to trust that site is worth doing. The problem with this video, the reason why I even want to talk about it, is that it has the exact same problem that every debunking power scaling video has. The problem is that it fundamentally misunderstands what power scaling is based on the actions of just a few people. Power scaling is not a method of media analysis, or a set of rules for a debate, or really anything else. Power scaling is just a hobby that some people find fun. Honestly, I think a lot of the worst aspects of the power scaling community come from when members of the community forget that it is just a hobby for fun. People taking power scaling deathly seriously is one of the most cringe things I've ever seen. It's really not that deep, guys. To get into the meat of the video itself, I think we need to start off by establishing the fact that Noah here has a bit of a surface level understanding of the power scaling community. Or at the very least, he isn't as plugged in as he seems to think he is. The fifth section of this video, which, by the way, is split into 5 sections with an intro and a conclusion, is about verse equalization. Very quickly, if you don't know, verse equalization is basically saying that we're going to try and make the rules of both universes apply at the same time. Like Noah says in his video, it makes the most sense with an example. In Boruto's dad, all humans, and I think all sentient life forms, and maybe even nature itself, has this force called chakra, which they use to do their jutsu or spells. Genjutsu, basically illusion magic, works by manipulating the opponent's chakra. Now, there was a time when people would argue that Genjutsu wouldn't work on people outside of the Naruto universe because they wouldn't have chakra. However, with verse equalization in play, you would assume that a Naruto character would be able to use their Genjutsu on a non-Naruto character, because as a sentient being, via the rules of the universe within Naruto, they would have chakra. Basically, what all this means is that without verse equalization in play, some characters just lose massive parts of their kits because those kits happen to interact with a universe-specific system that their opponent wouldn't have. In this section, Noah makes a mostly compelling argument for why verse equalization should be standard for all versus battles. I say mostly just because there are a couple of points here where I think he goes a tiny bit too far. Look at this clip.
If two characters from different pieces of fiction are meeting in a place to have a fight, you have to assume that that place is neutral ground. All the rules from both worlds apply to that place. This is verse equalization, the idea that things work the way they do where they came from. And it should be a mandatory inclusion in every single versus battle. And I actually think we should take this way further than we do. If you can sense chakra, you can sense ki. If you can sense mana, you can sense cursed energy. It's all the same stuff. If a character can, like, disable the powers of other characters, but only powers that exist within their universe, screw it. In a versus battle, it works on everybody. If the forces of evil in a universe can be destroyed with positive energy, any positive energy counts. The power of friendship counts. Reverse curse technique counts. D&D radiant magic counts. It all counts. In the anime Demon Slayer, the demons can only be killed by being decapitated with a particular kind of sword. If they're fighting in a cross-universe battle with a character that has any kind of weapon, that weapon has that property.
Now, I agree with the sentiment here, but I don't agree with every single example he uses. I don't know a lot about Demon Slayer, but I think there's a bit of a leap between saying you need a specific anti-demon weapon to hurt these guys and saying literally any kind of weapon works. And I say that because I think when we do versus content, we should try and stay true to what the work itself is saying. Using an example I know a bit more about here, Eraserhead's ability is to turn off quirks. These are basically mutations within the world of My Hero Academia, and any quirk that works by, like, being activated, he can turn off, but not mutations that make you look different. In a versus battle, I think whether or not Eraserhead's powers should work should be based on where his opponent's powers come from. Like any X-Men's powers, he should be able to turn off. Except for Beast, because if that was a quirk, he couldn't cancel out. It's a mutation. But if he fought Superman, Superman's powers aren't a mutation. They're normal abilities for his species if they're not exposed to kryptonite. If the power doesn't come from a mutation, why would Erasure work on it? Obviously, this is a subjective line to draw. There isn't a perfect answer for how two universes' power sets would interact. But I think staying true as you can to the intent of the material is the most fun and satisfying way to do versus debates. That's all a bit of an aside though. The real reason why I wanted to talk about this, at least up front before everything else, is because verse equalization and versions of it are very standard practice in the power scaling community. It did used to be more controversial, and the exact implications are still debated, especially when it comes to something like a character whose entire thing is that they interact with a mechanic from their universe in a very specific way. The point here is that using this as something that you hate about power scaling is just very strange. And this, along with some other examples throughout the video, really does give the impression that Noah didn't look too deeply into this material before talking about it. With that said, why don't we get to the first section of the video? Speed / the math doesn't lie, except yes, it absolutely does. Here, he describes how feats work in power scaling. Quick summary. What power scalers do is they take an impressive thing that a character does. Let's use Marie from Skullgirls lifting this building because I have the images on hand. And then they use math to see how strong that is and use that to determine how generally powerful the character who did that thing is. In this section of the video, Noah basically argues that we shouldn't use this logic to determine the power level of a character because of the existence of anti-feats. Yes, there is an actual name for this. An anti-feat is, well, it's what it sounds like. It's the opposite of a feat. A character getting hurt by something that they shouldn't, or being slower than they should be, or not being strong enough to accomplish something that they could previously do is being used as textual evidence against the claim that they are strong enough to do something by pointing at the contradiction. Noah's example is from Avatar, where Zuko does a bunch of faster than lightning stuff like absorbing lightning and dodging lightning or whatever, but then he also gets hit by normal arrows. Now, the exact way that you deal with anti-feats and whatnot is kind of a different discussion than what we're doing here. Because Noah's point isn't that anti-feats are superior to feats or anything like that. It's something that is actually far more interesting. Instead, Noah argues that what is most important in a versus debate shouldn't be a character's feats, it should be their vibes.
One of the greatest failings of power scaling as a system is its inability and refusal to acknowledge the importance of vibes. Just to take it back to the Avatar example, if Zuko is in a fight with like Electro and Electro shoots a lightning bolt at him, Zuko would be able to react to it, absorb it, and shoot it back. But if Zuko's in a fight with like John Wick and John Wick just like shoots him with a gun, I think Zuko would just get shot. I don't think Zuko can dodge bullets. He doesn't have bullet dodging vibes. And I know that the math doesn't make any sense on that, but that's why power scaling is dumb.
Now, this is a super interesting argument, and I think it's also an important argument because this is the most honest version of the refusal to accept power scaling logic that people have. Genuinely, the main reason why a lot of people reject power scalers and their conclusions is because, frankly, a lot of the time, it just sounds really stupid. It's easy to point to contradictions that would cause in the text, or the fact that the writers simply don't write this way, and say that power scalers are just illiterate and stupid. And they are kind of right about that. Most power scalers can't read. But in this same clip, we see the problem with this argument. To put it simply, this argument relies on the audience either not caring about consistency at all, or just being like, kinda stupid. The Zuko example is really illustrative here. So, full transparency, I haven't finished watching Avatar, so I don't have all the context. Maybe the lightning catching feats are less impressive in the actual show. But if you show me a character catching lightning with their bare hands, and then later on someone shoots a normal bullet or an arrow at them and they can't react to it, I'm gonna be very confused about what's happening because I know how fast lightning and bullets and arrows are, and that doesn't make any sense. Now, there's a lot of complexity here. There are a lot of reasons why high-end feats aren't always applicable to any situation. I think saying that a character has done something this fast before, therefore anything slower than that can never hit them, just isn't how that works. Characters can be distracted or focusing on something or overwhelmed by a lot of attacks at once. There's a lot of other things that go into it. But none of that was a part of Noah's argument, and that's the problem. I think in the haste to dunk on power scalers, many people really undersell how much the consistency and the abilities of characters matter in action shows like this. This bridges really well into my next point, which is that Noah and a lot of other people who try to debunk power scaling will almost always default to putting the blame for a contradiction or problem on power scalers and not on the media itself. Here's a great example of what I mean.
The speed of light isn't just like a speed, like the speed of sound is. Yeah, you just keep holding down the accelerator. You'll eventually get to the speed of light, and then you just keep going. You go even faster. The speed of light is the absolute speed limit of physical matter. Things can't go at the speed of light. If a character can go at or faster than the speed of light, like, okay, let's take like a Naruto character. Like a bunch of Naruto characters are allegedly able to go faster than the speed of light. Naruto characters are just like dudes. They're very powerful dudes, but like if you throw a sharp piece of metal at one of them, that's like a threat to their life. If any of these guys can just like go the speed of light, what's way more impressive than the speed that they're moving at is the fact that they're functionally invincible, because if they weren't, the air resistance would instantly completely incinerate them. And that's not to mention the other stuff, spatial relativity and time dilation, or that the shockwave produced from accelerating the thing the size of a human being to the speed of light would probably like destroy the earth, if we're being perfectly honest. Okay, well come on, Noah. Sure, in real life, the science would dictate that there's relativity and there's shock waves and stuff, but this is fiction. We don't have to deal with the consequences of that. That sucks. Yeah, but like now we don't have to account for science being real? 5 minutes ago, we were like, lightning in fiction has to be moving at real lightning speed. It doesn't make any sense otherwise, so all these people are Mach 1,000. And now we're like, oh, well, but the science doesn't matter.
So this is a really thought-provoking little tangle that Noah has pointed out here. Power scalers try to stick to the laws of physics whenever we can, and use that to argue that lightning has to be the speed of lightning in real life and whatnot. But then we just throw out those laws for the speed of light. And considering how big of a deal going the speed of light is in physics, that's a really weird thing to do. It's worth asking the question why power scalers think that we should just let characters go faster than light if we calc them at faster than light. Basically, why in this instance do power scalers just completely ignore all of the laws of physics? The answer is very simple, actually, because fiction authors did it first. There are just so many examples I could use of a character just inarguably going the speed of light or otherwise doing something incredibly stupid in terms of a speed feat. I bet it would take me like 5 seconds to find a speed feat of Flash going way over the speed of light and then find that same Flash getting tagged by somebody who was like a normal human in a DC comic. Some of my favorite examples of really stupid speed feats have to come from early Archie Sonic. At one point, Sonic is falling from like a really big height and he has to escape. So he pours some sand out of his shoe, throws it, and then runs across the sand before it has a chance to dissipate, which is wrong for so many reasons physics-wise. There's also a point where he throws balls of water like they're snowballs by moving so fast that the surface tension doesn't have time to break. But then that same Sonic gets hit by completely normal stuff and it hurts him, despite, being so much faster that he should be able to dodge it and moving so fast that air resistance should be burning him alive. The point I'm trying to make here is that this isn't just power scalers being silly and doing math to make characters sound stronger than they really are. Not all the time, at least. A lot of the time, a character will just be way stronger than they have any right to be, and that'll be a consistent part of the media, despite them regularly being threatened by things that they should not be threatened by. A good example of this, he brings up Naruto in that clip I showed and complains about how, according to power scalers, Naruto characters are faster than light, but that doesn't make any sense because they're basically just normal dudes. Like, they get hurt by Shuriken and Kunai, and they aren't these virtually invincible gods or whatever. Now, I will admit, I don't know a ton about late game Naruto, but didn't he split the moon in half at one point? Don't his attacks have explosion radii larger than mountains? I think that's just the show, dude. He shows a picture of someone who's apparently Naruto's space god, and he's being hurt by a basic-ass shuriken throw. These characters are just able to block and resist these countryside-destroying attacks, and still also get cut by pieces of metal. That's not power scalers being dumb, that's just how the manga is written. Now, I want to interject here and give a bit of a critique of the power scaling community, because I do understand why people reject a lot of these numbers and calcs that power scalers use to make their arguments. Hell, I don't believe the numbers that power scalers get a lot of the time. The issue with a lot of this discourse is that people who are trying to dunk on power scalers are trying to essentially disprove power scaling with the awesome power of media literacy or whatever. The problem is that they can never actually do that. Fundamentally, art is subjective in many ways. There are a lot of ways to interpret any piece of art. This applies to a lot of the artsy-fartsy stuff that's ultimately a lot more important than any of the dumb bullshit we're talking about right now. But it does still apply to questions like, how strong is this character? There are going to be a lot of valid interpretations for the power level of any one character, because almost any franchise is going to have some contradictions in it as to how strong a character is. You can try to be objective about it and use as many numbers as you can to make it more scientific, but when these contradictions crop up, how do you decide which interpretation to use? How do we decide on what rule set to apply to all media? Here's the rub. The rules of power scaling weren't decided by any one person. They weren't designed to be fair, they weren't designed to be consistent, hell, they weren't designed at all. No, the rules of power scaling ultimately are dictated by whatever people can get the other side of the debate to buy. The community is very decentralized. There isn't any voice that's capable of telling everybody that they're being silly or anything like that. So if an idea gets popular enough in the power scaling consciousness, it's just taken as law. And as we'll talk about a lot more later, there are a lot of people who just want their character to win any matchup at any cost, no matter the consequences. The consequence is what I like to call the big number bias. In power scaling, if there are multiple interpretations of a feat or general interpretations of how strong a character could be, because again, we have to decide what feats are outliers and which ones should be considered when they do contradict each other, the ones that become power scaling canon are almost always the highest ones imaginable. Even if a lot of people don't like it, even if most people don't agree that's how strong a character is and think a lower number would fit, someone always wants to highball a character and will keep trying to push the number up. And ultimately, the people that want to push the numbers up are a lot louder and more insistent than the people trying to push them back down. I think this is why a lot of non-power scalers look at the conclusions of power scaling discussions, especially on sites like Versus Battle Wiki, and recoil from how absurd they are. Obviously, this compounds on top of a lot of other small things, but the thing is, when people ask how strong a character is, they don't ask how strong can you possibly interpret them to be. They're asking how strong are they under the most reasonable interpretation of the text. If you combine that with the fact that often, even what I would consider the most reasonable interpretation of a character's power level is well above what most people would think, and you get a big problem. This is why so many of these videos miss the mark on the community. They seem to very rarely talk to any individual power scalers about their opinions. They don't seem to read the blogs that power scalers make to say what their thoughts are and how they came to those conclusions. They go to a wiki where all of the reasoning has been outsourced and where big number bias is in full effect, see that what's written there is crazy, and base their conclusions on that alone. Very quickly, I do just want to add that this is why most blogs have a low-end, mid-end, and high-end stat spread for their matchups. We take a general lowball given things that we see the characters do consistently, the absolute highest numbers you could possibly say the character has and not be wrong, and something in between that feels the most right to the people making the blog. And then they base the conclusion on who would win at each of those ends and how important each of those ends is. Alright, that was a long section. Let's move on to part 2. AP does not equal DC, or this guy can totally blow up a planet, bro trust. This section is mainly complaining about the distinction between attack potency and destructive capability. If you don't know, these two things are separated in power scaling terminology and refer to actual attack power versus its ability to destroy the environment. A really good example of this, and the one that Noah uses, is Dragon Ball. Goku is very obviously at least planet level in terms of attacking power and durability because he's taken the blast, or one that was as strong as the one that Frieza used to blow up a planet, and he's gotten like way stronger since then. But just because Goku is apparently planet level, that doesn't mean that every one of his punches destroys the Earth when he hits someone with it, because the planet's still there, obviously. That's because while the punches are at least planet level in terms of attack potency, their destructive capability is lower than that. They're capable of damaging things with planet level durability, but they don't have enough impact to destroy a whole planet. This distinction is kind of made up by power scalers, but I think it's a pretty reasonable distinction to make, and I don't think it's like completely made up. I think there are enough examples of this in real life for this distinction to make sense. I like to think of a high caliber rifle shot versus a car crash. Now, these two things are similarly lethal, but one of them causes a lot of damage to a very small area, while the other causes less damage over a much wider area. We could say they have similar AP, but have very different destructive capability. At least that's the idea. Now, Noah's issue with this distinction is a bit nuanced, but I think it's easiest to summarize as this distinction causing a lot of issues in certain corner cases. The main one he uses is that it leads to us having to say things like Broly slamming Goku into the Earth is an attack with above planetary attack potency, but far lower destructive capability, despite the fact that he's slamming him into the Earth and the Earth remains mostly intact. Like, This would make a lot more sense if Goku was just cutting through the ground like a hot knife in one of those online videos, but the ground seems pretty solid here. This gets even worse when we use this logic to argue that attacks from other series that are far more visually impressive wouldn't harm Goku because his durability is too high, when he takes attacks that look far less impressive and is still hurt by them. His example is from One Punch Man, where Saitama holds back from punching Genos and it destroys this mountain range behind him. Noah argues that this is both silly and an example of circular reasoning.
And you would probably assume that given Goku's reaction to this slam, this punch would just kill him. But this is not the case. According to power scaling law, this punch would do absolutely nothing to Goku, because this punch only has mountain level AP, whereas Broly's slams damaged Goku, so they have planet level AP plus whatever. But like, do you see the problem with what I just said? Do you see how that logic is circular? This punch wouldn't hurt Goku because it only has mountain level AP, whereas this slam did hurt Goku because it has planet level AP. And we know that it has planet level AP because it hurt Goku. You see what I'm saying? Like, the fact that this attack has mountain level DC shouldn't tell us anything about its AP, right? Its AP could be anything. It could be galactic. We don't know.
So, for one thing, I just don't think that this is a circular argument. That's just not the problem with what's happening here. The argument is that we know Goku has planetary durability at least, because we've literally seen him take attacks of that level with our own eyes. If we are willing to accept that Goku not only has planetary AP, but far beyond it because he's gotten a lot stronger since then we can safely assume that any attack that hurts him has very high AP, at least close to whatever his durability is. I think the actual problem here is that the numbers involved are just way too high and make telling a story very difficult. And Noah knows this and agrees with that statement. Take a look at this clip.
This is the difference between AP and DC. Broly must have planetary AP because he's hurting Goku, who has planetary durability, but his attacks do not have planetary DC, as you can see by the fact that they are not destroying the planet. Something can have a high AP, even if its DC makes it seem like it doesn't. And within the context of Dragon Ball, I'm completely fine with this. Like, I just accept that strong guys can hurt other strong guys with punches. When it isn't fine is when you start scaling between universes.
Not only does he say that he's fine accepting this in the context of Dragon Ball, but he says that he specifically accepts it because it would be annoying if literally every fight had to happen in space because every attack destroyed the planet. The thing is, that logic doesn't magically stop applying once you're outside of the Dragon Ball universe. Like, I don't really understand why he's so against the idea that we should say that less than planet level attacks shouldn't hurt Goku when he seems to accept that, yeah, Goku does have at least planetary durability, we just aren't going to take that into account visually in every fight because that makes it less fun. From here, he extrapolates that this would be a problem because I guess characters that he thinks shouldn't be planet level are called planet level or higher. He doesn't really articulate exactly where this is an issue beyond using an example from the MCU that I can't talk about in too much depth because I haven't seen the more recent MCU movies. Noah's general grievance seems to be that the AP-DC distinction can be used to inflate the AP of universes, which, yeah, it can, that is why power scalers use it. But he argues that this has negative consequences. His example is from when Thor tanks a blast from a neutron star, and argues that this has terrible consequences for the MCU's power scaling. But the example he uses just doesn't really scan for me.
But then my actual favorite example of this is, so there's this part in Avengers Infinity War where Thor has to stand in this thing and get blasted by a laser for a few minutes. It's a laser from a star. And Peter Dinklage is there and he's like, "Are you sure about this, boy? You're about to get blasted by the full power of a neutron star." And then Thor just kind of like does that. He just stands there getting blasted by a star for like a few minutes. Now this, by like any and beyond all metrics is a star level durability feat. The thing is that by power scaling law, this now makes like everybody in the entire MCU star level. Thanos beat up Thor, so that gives Thanos star level AP, and the Hulk was able to like knock Thanos back with his punches, so that makes him star level, and Hulk beat up Loki, but Loki like lived and was fine, so that gives Loki star level durability, and Loki took damage from Hawkeye shooting him with an explosive arrow, so that arrow is star level.
The problem here, and maybe this is just my lack of knowledge, but this entire scaling chain, save for the last bit with Hawkeye, is completely fine. And the bit with Hawkeye is wrong, as admitted by Noah in a comment below the video. Thanos, Hulk, and Loki all being relative to Thor, and that being star level, doesn't sound weird to me. I don't remember any time when the other characters were implied to be like about as physically strong as any of them, with the sole exception of like the Hulkbuster armor, which is made specifically to counter Hulk. And yeah, Iron Man being able to build anything that's around star level is kinda dumb. But at the same time, he made the original Iron Man suit out of scrap in a cave. He made a time machine. Like, it's not completely unreasonable to think that he could make something that powerful. Maybe the argument is, if Tony could build something that strong, why didn't he do it at any other point? But like, you could probably just apply that to the Hulkbuster armor in general. If the Hulkbuster armor is that powerful, why not use it more? Maybe it's because it takes a lot of resources. He doesn't have to rebuild it all the time. I don't know. I don't remember them addressing that. Anyway, this is also an area where I think people are dunking on power scalers for a problem that they didn't create. Because maybe the problem here isn't the scaling chain, but the fact that Thor being star level in the MCU is kinda stupid. I don't know why it would be stupid. I don't know where that comes in. I don't remember any part where this creates problems, but if it does, maybe that's the problem. You know, Loki, Hulk, and Thanos should be relative to Thor power level wise. That makes sense. Iron Man's best machines should be kinda relative to them. The thing is, creators for action series love to throw in these giant spectacle feats for characters without considering what it implies about the rest of the series and the problems it'd create. This is why having a power system boiled down to who punches harder will almost always end up running into an issue after a long enough amount of time, like Dragon Ball has. You know, you start with showing someone blow up a whole mountain, and that's like super cool. And then you have to top that, so you show someone blowing up a mountain range. And you have to top that, and so you show someone blowing up a whole continent. And then you get the villain who can blow up a whole planet. And once you get to this point, and honestly even before that, the fights start to make very little sense logistically. Like, if these characters can destroy the entire planet immediately, how are we ever going to write a fight between them without there being massive casualties? Why aren't villains constantly pulling a Frieza in Resurrection F and blowing up the planet as a last resort? The anti-power scaler argument is probably that you shouldn't just assume that a character should scale to another character because they beat them in a fight or whatever, but like, I think you guys are downplaying the problem here. Like, yes, it is possible to write a series in a way where a character being another character in a fight doesn't mean that they should be as strong as them or as fast as them or whatever, but you have to do the work to make sure that that is actually the case. You can't just say, this character can tank a blast from a neutron star, and then have them get punched by a normal human in the next scene, and have that knock them out, and expect the audience to be okay with that. I think people may say that this critique is a bit cinema-sensy, that I'm just pointing out tiny plot holes and complaining about them, instead of actually engaging with the material itself, and frankly, I just don't think that that's true. I feel like the backlash to CinemaSins and people like them who are overly literal about art in their critique, while overall a good thing, I want to say that for the record right now, it is overall a good thing, it has had a negative side effect of making people think that they just shouldn't care about the movies or shows they watch actually making sense. It is not a death blow for a show to have a plot hole in it. It really, really isn't. It's not the biggest deal for a show to have some inconsistencies, or yes, for the power scaling of a show to not make sense sometimes. But there's a difference between a few things slipping through the cracks and just not having any interest in the actual things that are happening in the media you're creating. I think that paying close attention to tiny details in a story and having those details matter later on can be really rewarding, and that applies to things like the power scaling of a universe. This is a bit of a loose example, but I think Jujutsu Kaisen is actually a good example of this. If you haven't seen the anime or read the manga, sorry, this is gonna be kind of boring for you, but a lot of time in the anime is spent showing how strong the characters are and how their powers work and yada yada, typical shonen anime stuff. The thing is, JJK, more so than some other manga and anime around, pays pretty close attention to detail with that kind of thing. If you just watch the show and pay attention to what's happening in it, you get a pretty good sense of how strong everyone is and how big the gaps between the characters are. The anime and manga go out of their way to reinforce this at points even, and there are distinct payoffs for doing so. My favorite example is the fight between Yuji, the main character, and Hiromi Higuraga. There's a lot going on here, I'm not going to explain all of it, but at the start of the fight, after Yuji and Higuraga both realize that they can't hash this out by talking, we get to hear an internal monologue from Yuji as he sizes up his opponent. We, like Yuji, are trying to figure out how big of a threat Higuraga is. And then this happens.
Higuruma has 100 points. He might have killed 20 sorcerers already, but I'll be ready to respond to any attack.
Domain expansion. Deadly sentencing.
And at that moment, anyone who had been watching the show all the way up to this point probably just shit their pants. For the uninitiated, domain expansions are like the most powerful move in JJK. They are the pinnacle of a sorcerer's power, and the only reason Yuji has survived being in them up until now is because the demon inside of him, Sukuna, stopped Mahito's expansion specifically because it would interact with Yuji's soul, and therefore Sukuna himself. So like, this is a really big deal, and it immediately tells us that Yuji is in big trouble. We then realize that Higuruga's domain is different to the others we've seen. And then the narrator comes in and tells us that Higuruga learned sorcery by himself, basically in reverse, starting with his domain expansion and intuiting the rules of basic things like cursed energy control, the most basic thing in the franchise's power system, from that. This instantly tells the audience that Higuruga is both super strong and like wicked smart. All of this makes the fight gripping from the literal first moment. And if the show hadn't spent so long explaining how its own rules worked and making sure all of the fights in the show followed them up until now, it just wouldn't be anywhere near as tense and exciting as it is. Now, the attention to detail and the consistency is not what makes this part of the anime good. The characters, the themes, the interactions between Higuruga and Yuji is what carries. That is the story. That is what is ultimately most important. But still, by paying attention to the details, by keeping track of how strong all of these characters are, how their abilities work, how those things come together to shape these fights, the show is able to make this scene so much better. That diatribe is all to say that power scaling internally within a story is very important. It's not the thing that makes a story good or bad, obviously, but it does matter at some level. And I think we should be able to look at examples of a story using its power system poorly and in short-sighted and ill-thought-out ways and call that bad writing. Let's go back to the Thor example, because if it is true that Thor being star level screws up the scaling chain in the MCU and makes the entire cinematic universe make way less sense, maybe that's not an issue with power scalers for pointing that out. Maybe that's a problem with the writers for making a character way stronger than they should be in the context of the stories they're telling. I can't say for certain that's what's going on here, but I do know of other examples where this is absolutely a problem. So in this video, Noah makes fun of how strong the Sonic cast is supposed to be according to Versus Battle Wiki. And he should. It's very stupid how high their scaling fucking Charmy be. But the problem is that based on the text of the Sonic games, there are actual arguments for the universe of Sonic being like stupidly strong. The most blatant and completely ridiculous example is from, you guessed it, Sonic Forces. So the main bad guy of the game is Infinite, this edgelord with a new MacGuffin called the Phantom Ruby that makes illusions so real that they, like, are real. Like, they're still illusions, but they physically affect you in the world because people believe that they're real so hard. Don't think about it too much. It doesn't make that much sense. Anyway, at the end of the game, Infinite makes a literal army of Shadows, Zavix, Chaoses, and Metal Sonics, and they go to war with not only like every named character in the series, besides Blaze, because the writers hate me, but also a bunch of literal civilians with what amount to basic weaponry. Now, in some context, that wouldn't be that big of a deal, but the gap between the power level of these guys and normal civilians is massive. Even if you don't buy chain scaling or anything like that, Metal Sonic is easily able to break the sound barrier casually. He can shoot lasers and stuff. Shadow can throw blasts of chaos energy. He can teleport. He can tank gunfire and be completely unfazed. He can flip an entire semi-truck with one hand. Chaos Zero? Actually, he's kind of a bitch. I don't see why they didn't go with one of his stronger forms. But still, not only does Charmy B take out several of these much more powerful characters, but randos with what amount to like basic flamethrowers and like energy weapons do as well. And it's not like these are pale imitations. Infinite directly states that the copies are as powerful as the original versions, and they lose to literally unnamed characters. The point here is that they're not supposed to have heart or friendship on their side, so they're not as good as actual people, but like, are we supposed to buy that the power of friendship is a literal superpower in this universe that makes these unnamed guys substantially more powerful than Shadow the Hedgehog? They don't even like outsmart the clones or anything. I mean, the clones are pretty stupid, but it's not like the Resistance was fighting much smarter than them. At the end of the day, if you know like anything about these characters, and I'll remind you that you are supposed to remember how strong they are, that's the entire point of bringing them back for this game, watching with those previous scenes in mind makes this entire fight seem really stupid. It just does not make any sense that the clones are losing this fight. This has been an extremely long walk for an agonizingly small drink of water. I understand. Believe me, I do. But I wanted to make this point in particular very clear. Before you criticize power scalers for saying a character is way too strong and just assume that all of the metrics they use to determine a character's power level are completely stupid, please ask yourself why you think the conclusion is wrong. Is it because the argument being made is bad, or is it because the character's power is just inconsistent in the material? And if that's the case, whose fault is that? Alright, on to the next section of the video. Dimensional scaling, or outerversal, is not a thing. He is entirely correct about this. On to the next section. Obsession with numbers, or... okay, no, I'll actually talk about dimensional scaling a bit. Dimensional scaling is the stupidest thing that's accepted by power scalers en masse. But the reason why it's stupid and how we got to this point are a bit complicated. Noah, as good as a job as he does here, just doesn't have the context to properly break this down. So first off, I'm just going to play some clips from his video to explain dimensional scaling because I hate it and he does a good job. Go watch his video, it's good.
Basically, the idea is that if you are a 4-dimensional thing, you are infinitely more powerful than any 3-dimensional thing. And then if you're a 5th-dimensional thing, well, you're infinitely more powerful than any 4th-dimensional thing. And then that keeps going up and up and up and up until you get to like infinite-dimensional things. And then above that is what they call outerversal, which is where you are beyond the concept of dimensionality and physical space entirely.
So now that we know what dimensional scaling is, here's why it's stupid. Later on in this video, Noah will criticize power scalers for reducing everything and every matchup to a number. Now personally, I don't think that I do this when I engage with the hobby, nor do the people I share the hobby with. It is something that does happen, though, and I'll talk more about where this criticism is and isn't pointed later on. But I bring this up because dimensional tiering is the one place where this is absolutely correct. Once you establish that a character is literally unable to be affected by the other because they are infinitely above them, that's it. That's the end of the argument. There's no reason to even do any calcs, look at their abilities, analyze their battle style and personality to see what would happen. The only thing that matters is the number. This is why whenever I've engaged in the hobby, I either just ignore matchups that are determined by dimensional scaling or just straight up pretend it doesn't exist when it does come up. It just isn't fun. It takes away the things that I think are fun about a versus matchup in order to wonk about the cosmology of the universe or whatever the fuck. In essence, I agree with Noah when he says that once you get above universe level, you should just stop. I don't care if Superman is infinite universal or infinite complex multiversal or shitiversal or whatever. Talking about this is just not interesting to me anymore. The thing that's more frustrating to me is why we're even talking about this in the first place, as in why power scalers accept the concept of dimensional scaling at all. Believe it or not, this isn't something that one guy just came up with to win an argument about why Batman beats Superman. It, like going faster than light, is commonplace in certain pieces of media. I think the easiest example that comes to mind is Godzilla from Singular Point. I haven't seen the show, but from what my friend who has watched it and is a big Godzilla buff has told me, the basic idea is that Godzilla isn't from our dimension. He's from a higher dimension. And as a higher dimensional being, we literally cannot harm him in a way that matters. The show explains it with the concept of shadows. We, as three-dimensional objects, cast a 2D shadow. However, a 4D object would cast a 3D shadow. Now, if you were to mess with the 2D shadow of a 3D object, it wouldn't actually do anything to that three-dimensional object. The shadow isn't connected to the object, but the object does still affect the shadow. Things only go one way, effectively. The concept behind Singular Point is that Godzilla, the big lizard monster, is just a shadow. A 3D shadow cast by a higher dimensional object. And while it can interact with us because we are 3D, we cannot meaningfully interact with the real Godzilla, the higher dimensional being. We can only interact with the shadow that it's casting upon our world. This and ideas similar to it pop up in a lot of different media, and it is a really fun idea. It inspires a sort of Lovecraftian horror that's difficult to replicate otherwise. However, and I cannot stress this enough, there is no reason to accept that this is how higher dimensions work. There are mathematical arguments you can make, but they all have a number of issues. Mainly, it involves assuming that mass is a function of volume. That's a very nerdy thing to say, so let me explain that. Imagine a 2D object in our world, a true 2D object, one with height and length but no width. If you were to stack an infinite number of these 2D sheets on top of each other, you would never actually get a 3D stack, unlike with paper, because their width isn't just minusculely small, it's literally zero. And 0 times infinity is still 0. The argument then goes that this also applies to higher dimensions. No amount of three-dimensional mass can contend with four-dimensional mass, essentially. Now, this certainly might be how the universe works, but it also might not be. I've heard arguments that string theory postulates that all matter may be made of one-dimensional points or lines, and that in our universe, mass may have literally arisen without necessarily being three-dimensional, but I'm also not going to pretend that I understand string theory literally at all. The reason dimensional scaling exists is that some comic book or manga wrote that their character was higher dimensional using something like the shadow example, and people just rolled with it. More specifically, they didn't just roll with it in those stories, they expanded it outward. Now, every universe is expected to operate under dimensional scaling logic, even if that universe does not impose those rules. There are actually examples here of times that this just doesn't apply to a piece of media. The most obvious one I can think of is Mr. Game & Watch in Super Smash Bros. Like, Mr. Game & Watch is literally made of a two-dimensional object in the game. He's literally flat if you, like, look at him with the camera, but he's still able to affect all of the other characters, and if you're gonna try and actually scale Super Smash Bros. Characters, as weird as that is, you would have to say that he's at least able to affect three-dimensional objects. However, under dimensional scaling logic, that should literally be impossible. Now, you can get around this by saying, well, since he can affect 3D characters, he must simply scale to 3D, and we know he can scale to 3D because he can affect 3D characters. But, like, I don't know, at some point it just feels like we're doing everything we can to keep imposing this rule instead of just accepting the fact that sometimes media isn't written this way, and we have no reason to assume that this is how things work. Now, I think it's really important to point out that this is different to what power scalers normally do. Normally, we just assume that physics works the same way as it does in our world in every universe to the best of our ability. I think that's a reasonable assumption unless the media in question explicitly states otherwise. However, here, we're not appealing to science or objectivity to determine the strength of the characters. We're appealing to some guy's interpretation of a mathematical argument or metaphor that they thought sounded cool. There just isn't a reason to accept that this is how things work across the board. It's just assumed for some complicated reasons. As I said earlier, in power scaling, we try to respect the source material's rules as much as we can. So when we talk about a character like Godzilla from Singular Point, who is higher dimensional and that makes them immune to damage, we have to implement that into their power set. But then if you want to have that character be in a matchup against a character from a different franchise, you have to ask, have they gone into higher dimensional space? What would count as a higher dimensional space in their universe, even though that universe may not operate under that logic? We have to answer the question of, can a character who has not been explicitly stated to have this higher dimensional power hurt the character who does? The answer to that is subjective, but honestly, I just don't find it interesting to answer. I would usually just ignore the higher dimensionality of characters or do a different matchup if this were asked to me. But the average power scaler is either a lot more stubborn or a lot dumber than I am. This is where the rule by popularity I talked about earlier comes into play. People didn't think about the pros and cons and decide dimensional scaling should be applied. It's just that dimensional scaling quickly became very popular with people who are able to use it to wonk their characters a ton. This type of esoteric nonsense is incredibly popular with losers who need their favorite character to win whatever matchup. If you combine this with the fact that it is, like, legit really hard to figure out what to do with the character whose story involves dimensional scaling logic if they fight a different character, and dimensional scaling kind of just became the norm by default. Some people really want it to exist for agenda reasons, and everyone else simply doesn't have a better idea for what to propose in its place. Now, I do want to comment on some of the more specific things that Noah said in this dimensional scaling section, because some of them are not fully correct. Or at the very least, there's a lot more going on. I specifically want to comment on Joker and the Persona 5 cast. So, at the end of P5, you shoot Yaldabaoth in the head with a big-ass gun and kill him. Yaldabaoth is a god who is able to affect a realm that is substantially higher than the world that Joker and the Phantom Thieves are from before that fight. He can destroy and recreate reality at his whim, and he can kill other godlike beings and mess with their minds, such as Igor and the attendants. He even states before the fight, I'm pretty sure, that it is literally impossible for Joker and the others to even harm him. This reinforces the idea that he is a higher power in a dimensional scaling or at least divine sense. And you kill him, meaning that Joker is now at that level. This means that Joker is at least infinitely superior to any character whose power level is limited by at least 3-dimensional space and time. Or at least, I think that's a reasonable assumption given what we see in Persona 5. That alone is not out reversal. The problem is that this is all connected to a ton of stuff in SMT, because Persona is in the same universe as Shin Megami Tensei, and there is a ton of weird cosmology stuff in that series that is directly dealing with concepts that are outerversal, and everything in Persona can scale to that. Now, I haven't played SMT, I'm not going to pretend I have, but I have talked to people who have read it and played through it and know a lot more about it, and they tell me that, like, yes, there is a lot of stuff here, and you can argue that Yaldabaoth scales to some of it, which would put him, like, pretty high up in this stupid dimensional scaling chain. Essentially, what happens at the end of Persona 5 is kind of like if the Losers Club in Stephen King's It actually did kill Pennywise forever, and they did it by punching him really hard without God's help. And if that happened in a piece of media, yeah, that character would be outerversal. There's really not a different way to interpret that. I absolutely agree that a character that fights by punching or shooting a gun probably shouldn't be outerversal. But sometimes that's just what the text of the material says, regardless of how silly any of us think that it is. Okay, now we can finally move on to the last section, obsession with numbers. This is going to be the shortest section of this video because it's an area where he has a bit of a point, but I think he's once again a bit misguided. Noah complains that power scalers like to reduce matchups to just the numbers they calculate, and they ignore everything else about a matchup, like the character's abilities, how they would interact with the opponent's abilities, and the character's personalities. This is a thing that some people do, and those people are stupid. Still, at the same time, the stats do matter in a matchup, and the degree to which one character has a stat advantage over the other is something that people will talk about. It's just very contextual and depends a lot on the abilities the characters have. If we're talking about a character like Goku, whose abilities are martial arts, ki beams, flying, transformations, and a few hacks like the solar flare and multi-body form, then the character's stats are a big part of the equation for who wins. But in the case of something like Satoru Gojo versus Jotaro from JoJo's, the entire matchup is dictated just by how Infinity would interact with Time Stop. By the way, Jotaro's powers are that he has a ghost called a stand that punches stuff really hard, and he can stop time. That's all you really need to know about him for our purposes. Here, the stats of the characters basically don't matter at all. If Jotaro can stop time and kill Gojo, then, well, he can stop time and kill him. But if stopping time doesn't pause Infinity, then Jotaro just has no way of hurting Gojo ever, and he loses. The entire matchup comes down to just debating how these powers would interact with each other. In the middle, we have a matchup like Batman versus Iron Man. These guys both have a ton of gadgets and are both like super smart, and they've also built some mechs that are really strong and can do some stupid broken stuff. So if you wanted to talk about who would win this matchup, you have to ask questions like how strong and fast they are, but also what gadgets they have that would work well against the other one. Can they hack into each other's equipment? How would Iron Man counter Batman's stealth? How would they go about enacting a plan to get around the other's gadgets or stop them from getting to their best mech suits if it comes down to that? How quickly would they be able to identify and understand the other's inventions? There's a lot to talk about. The numbers and the abilities matter, and it's kind of a puzzle to figure out how all of this would interact with each other. This is how most power scalers understand matchups, at least the ones who aren't completely agenda poisoned. Noah just hasn't talked to enough power scalers to understand that. Or to be more charitable to him, his understanding of the community is based on its loudest and dumbest members who populate sites like Versus Battle Wiki and the YouTube comments. There is one more thing he says in this segment of the video that I want to talk about, and that's the focus that he puts on the narrative of a character. He contends that power scalers only care about the characters as number puppets that can be dropped into fights, and they ignore the narrative surrounding a character, despite that being the most important thing about them. This is a bit of a strange contention to me, because outside of the more out there examples he brings up, I'm not sure what the implications of this are even supposed to be. Like, yes, every character in a story is a part of a larger narrative, but we aren't trying to write a fan fiction here. That's a different hobby. We're just trying to see who's stronger, who's more likely to win if the characters were to fight. Obviously, if these characters met in an actual crossover, what would happen would be very different, but that's not what we're trying to do here. And again, the implications of taking into account the narrative of a character get really weird really fast. Like, do we give every protagonist an inherent buff because they're supposed to win all of their fights in canon? Is every villain just nerfed if they go against a good guy? I really do feel like this contention is only meaningful when you bring up characters like Squirrel Girl or Saitama, as he does in the video, where their entire joke is just how strong they are. An interesting thing about this is that even in official material, these characters can be portrayed in more dynamic ways if the situation calls for it. Like, Squirrel Girl is in Marvel Rivals, and she's not the best character in the game. In fact, I think she's kind of bad. The joke is less that she's unbeatable in that game, and more just that she's silly, because that's what a hero shooter demands of its character. This is the real reason why the Stan Lee quote exists. The character who wins in a fight is whoever the author wants to win. The way characters are used changes depending on the context of the material in question. And if that material in question is, let's say, an objective analysis of who's most likely to win in a fight based on their previous material, shouldn't the demands of that context also change how we look at these characters? At least only for the purposes of versus debating. And if doing that does go completely against the point or appeal of a certain character, maybe you just shouldn't do versus debates with them because it's not fun or interesting. You know, this is a totally subjective take on things, but it's the one that I think leads to the most fair and fun setup for these discussions. If that's just not what you value in these debates, that's totally fine. But I think you should understand why some people wouldn't want to spend that long debating which character would be more likely to win based on their vibes and narrative purpose. Like, that's just not really what people are thinking when they ask this question. That is the last individual section where he goes over a power scaling topic, but there is one last important segment of the video. Noah concludes his video by drawing a distinction between the two types of games being played. He considers himself and others like him to be playing the game Who Would Win a Fight, but says that power scalers are playing My Dad Could Beat Your Dad. I won't explain it too much further. If you want to hear what he has to say, go watch his video. If you leave a hateful comment, I will personally break into your house and move everything you own 1 centimeter to the left. You will not know that I did anything, but you'll subconsciously be afraid for at least a week. Seriously, do not be shitting in his comment section. I will be very mad. Anyway, I think my response to this whole thing is going to be pretty unsurprising. Like, yes, this is a problem. I've talked about people who are agenda poison in this video already, but that isn't the entire power scaling community. There are reasonable people in this community, and saying that everything you don't like in the hobby comes specifically from people arguing maliciously is just not true. Fundamentally, most power scalers do this because they think it's fun, not because their ego is tied to whether or not Batman could beat up Superman. But more importantly, I think this is also just not a convincing argument. One of the reasons I made this video is because I want to try and improve communication between people critical of power scaling and the community. And I feel like this should go without saying, but you're never going to reach people if you do nothing but put them down. Now, Noah isn't like rude or shitty or across the line in this video. The places where you could argue he is are clearly hyperbole for the sake of comedy. But I still don't think he's coming at this the right way. By focusing on power scaling as a community and attacking the entire thing by pointing to its worst aspects, you give all power scalers the ability to ignore you by just saying, well, I don't do that. And that's a fair response if they really don't. It isn't a no true Scotsman fallacy to admit that some people in the same community as you are dumb. I do think there is a problem with the power scaling community, with the people who are really loud and annoying online and do nothing but leave comments on people's videos saying how stupid they are for lowballing their favorite character. However, that problem, I think, can only really be solved, or at least improved, by changes within the overall culture and wider attitudes that are held within the community. You can't change those attitudes if your content makes power scalers the other, someone who has to be defeated or conquered. This is a problem that's going to have to be solved by people inside the community first and foremost. And people outside the community making videos like this honestly just makes the situation worse by building up an us versus them mentality. Not to mention, it gives a lot of people who don't actually engage with power scaling a smug sense of self-satisfaction for thinking that they're better than an entire community of people. I'm not gonna blame Noah for taking his video in this direction. He hasn't done anything like morally wrong here. It's just that there's an entire process going on with this conversation that just makes it worse and worse all the time. And worse than that, it's making changing things for the better even more difficult. Alright, thank you for watching this video if you made it all the way to the end. Like, comment, subscribe if you want to support the channel. And if you really want to support the channel, you can become a member. You'll get access to all my videos a full day early, and I shout out all my members at the end of every video. So, big shout outs to Elric111, Agent B7, Joseph Florian, GB484, Atria Gaming, Bladed Fox 14, Shredding Pixels, and Robo Nerd.